What's the scariest story you know that is 100% true? This is an incident that happened to me about 10 years ago. I live in Melbourne, Australia. I was driving home from work one night around 9 p.m. midweek, so the roads were quiet. As I was driving downhill, I heard a sound that was like a jet engine roaring behind me. The next thing I know, a car goes flying past me going twice the speed limit. It looked like a fairly old, crappy car. The car started to get the speed wobbles, and then one of the tires came flying off and rolled at speeds downhill whilst the car spun out and crashed. I stopped my car to make sure whoever inside was okay. A guy got out of the car and looked over at me, then started moving extremely quickly towards me. I don't know why, but I hit my internal locks on the car, which was fortunate because no more than 2 seconds later, the guy started grabbing at the driver's side door and smashing on my windscreen with his fists trying to get in. You'll never forget the crazy look he had in his eyes. I put my foot down on the accelerator and drove off back home. I decided to swap cars once I got home and drove back to see what was going on. I saw 2 fire trucks and about 4 police close to where the incident happened. When I got back to the crash site, the guy was no longer there, so I decided to head home. The next day at work, I was online bored reading the news when I saw an article that shocked me. The article was about a guy who had been in a police chase for 1 hour, and the police stopped chasing him because it was becoming too dangerous. Turns out the guy was high on meth, had stolen a car an hour's drive away, and had been in a hot pursuit since. After crashing the car, the guy apparently crossed to the other side of the road and hailed the first car that appeared, which was a taxi. He got into the taxi and stole it. In the process, he pushed the driver out of the driver's side door, and the driver got stuck and dragged at speeds. The driver died from the incident. I called the police and had a detective assigned to me. He fingerprint checked my car and got a statement. I had to testify in the Supreme Court as a key witness in a murder trial. The guy got 30 years, and they told me that my testimony was one of the main factors in convicting him. I often think back to that night and wonder if I hadn't locked my doors, would I have been the one who got murdered? Edit. Found the article about it. He got 17.5 years, not 30. A man who murdered a Melbourne taxi driver during a violent rampage 2 years ago has been sentenced to 17.5 years jail. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Back in the 90s, my mom was on the highway heading home from a friend's house late at night. She was driving a really nice Thunderbird. After a while, this big white van drove next to her, and the driver started performing some very rude gestures, and being young and dumb, my mom reciprocated the gestures. Then the dude pulled up a big Bowie knife to the window. My mom started panicking and sped up to get away, and the van was following right along. Then the guy tried to run her off the road. Keep in mind, they're probably going about 100 miles per hour. She gets on the exit to get home, and he's still following her. When she does get back to her house, which she shared with my grandparents, she pulled into the driveway honking the horn and screaming, trying to wake someone up. The van pulls into the driveway just as my grandfather comes out in his underwear with a gun. The dude got scared and drove off. My mom wouldn't leave her house for months except for school, but never at night. I have posted this before too from a different ID I used to have. This still haunts me to date. This is from the days when I used to live back home. I used to live in Karachi, Pakistan, but now moved to UK. We used live very close to a CID, Police Investigation Department, aka Pakistani FBI building, which we all were unaware of and always thought it was just an ordinary government building till on the 11th of November 2010. On that day, around evening time coming home from work, I thought I better hit the gym because they had a sauna, and after being tired from all day work that sounded like a good idea, which was hardly 0.3 miles away, so I decided to walk to the gym. I change quickly and leave for the gym and start walking towards the gym. I've hardly walked like 10 minutes and I'm 0.1 miles away roughly, and all of a sudden for a nanosecond I feel that ground is shaking, and the next thing I hear is a loudest bang I've ever heard, followed by a pressure kick into my chest. Now, to let you guys know, both the ears started bleeding because the bang was so loud, and for the reference, the kick in the chest was as bad as Big Show wearing military boots and kicking you in the chest straight with full force. Next thing, I'm on the ground covering my ears because they are in agony and covered in dirt trying to figure out what's happening. As I am trying to figure out, I can see all the car's alarms have gone off. Anything made up of glass has been shattered in roughly 1 to 2 miles area. I'm still trying to figure out what has happened, and I start smelling gunpowder and as if someone is making a BBQ and is being burnt. I will always remember that smell, which was something unsettling. Next, rock and dust particles starts landing on me and the surrounding areas, which had 1 to 1.5 inches long of pieces of human skin and flesh. I am not believing that I have another human skin piece stuck to my arm. I brush up my clothes and arms, getting up and covering my ear, recovering from that pressure kick. As I move closer to a spot in a street where I am hearing loads of people screaming and crying, I see a few 3 to 5 foot cracks between some walls of the building which have been destroyed by the shockwave of the bang. I see the gap between a wall and move into the area where I see these scenes straight from a Hollywood movie where people are crying, cars on fire, and dead bodies on the ground. By this time, I'm thinking it's a bomb blast and that's what has happened. As I move closer, I see a 10-foot and 30-foot wide crater which has been filled with the water, and the building, which was a CID building, is no longer there. There are hundreds of people lying on the ground crying for help, as some of them don't even have legs or limbs, or some don't have their complete bottom. I am still in a state of shock, looking around, and I see a woman crying and hitting herself because she had her husband dead, whose legs and torso was missing. I seen that later. I see several people without legs, brains out, and no hands. One thing, which haunted me for sure, was a 18 to 20-year-old guy who was dead and lying on the floor towards his chest on the floor with his neck turned towards me. I can still remember him looking straight into my eyes. His feet were flipped the other way around. After the police arrived and media arrived, I came back home after it got crowded. After I came home after the dusk every day, I would see that 18 to 20-year-old boy standing and staring into my eyes. I would wake up screaming throughout the night and see that guy standing at the doorway just staring at me. For 2 to 3 weeks, I would see this guy regularly during midnight standing in my hallway, staring through my soul. I still remember that guy's face and the shockwave and the sound of the blast. According to BBC, it said, eyewitnesses said the blast left a crater 12 meters, 40 feet wide in front of the gutted building in Pakistan's financial and commercial capital. The story of Mary Vincent. I love true crime and don't usually get squeamish, but this story is probably the most disturbing true crime story I have heard yet. Mary Vincent was 15 years old when she decided to run away from home on September 28, 1978. She was hitchhiking along the highway in Soquel, California, standing with two other hitchhikers. A man pulled up in a van and said he only had room for her, but not the others. The man driving the van was 51-year-old Larry Singleton. He offered to drive Mary to the I-5 freeway. As he drove, Mary realized that he had passed the ramp to the I-5 and demanded he turn around. Larry said it was an honest mistake and turned around. Soon after, he pulled over and told Mary he needed to go to the bathroom and couldn't wait for a rest stop. When he got out of the van, Mary realized her shoe was untied and got out to tie it. As she was tying her shoelaces, Larry came behind her and hit her over the head with a sledgehammer. He then proceeded to rape and sodomize her. This is where it gets even worse. Larry took a fucking hatchet and cut off both of her arms, just below the elbow. Both of her arms. He then threw her down a 30-foot culvert in a canyon and drove off. The most astounding part of the whole story is that Mary survived. She used what was left of her strength and made her way 3 miles out of the embankment, with no fucking arms below the elbow, nude, and was stumbling down the road when she saw a car. The first car she saw sped away in fear. The second car she saw was driven by a couple who were on vacation. They stopped the car, helped her into their truck, and drove her to a nearby airport where they were able to get an ambulance, and she was taken to a hospital. Mary is a fucking badass. She then testified twice against Larry, but he only served 8 years and 4 months for attempted murder, forcible rape, sodomy, kidnapping, mayhem, and forced oral copulation. Seriously, the most fucked up story, he got out on good behavior. Later, he murdered a sex worker and was sentenced to death and died in 2001 on death row. Edit. Okay, I didn't really expect this to blow up this much. Some things to address. First, the judge was not a bad judge. He gave him the maximum sentence, 14 years, that was allowed by the law at that time. During the sentencing, he even said that he would have given Larry a life sentence if the law allowed him to. Second, Mary survived because she is a badass. She didn't give up and was able to pack mud around what was left of her arms in order to stop the bleeding. This, in addition to keeping her arms raised, was how she stayed alive. Third, I first heard this story on my favorite murder podcast, but it has also been covered on other podcasts and shows like I Survived. If you like true crime, definitely check out My Favorite Murder, tons of other interesting stories. This is ongoing, maybe too late to get noticed. I live in a modest house on a quiet street. 9 years ago, someone bought the house next to me to basically shelve their 18-year-old schizophrenic son. They pay the rent and utilities and occasionally drop off cash. He has done about as well as an unmanaged schizophrenic can do on his own. To paint an image, he is a muscular black guy with telltale crazy eyes. He stands on his balcony around 3 a.m., most nights screaming and threatening. Someone, voices, me, I can't tell. The first major incident was when he shot a deer from his second-story balcony. It was standing across the street about 4 feet from a neighbor's bedroom. The police came and left when he didn't answer. I woke up to SWAT in my bushes the next morning with some serious scoped weapons. He left with them, but returned in a few weeks. Astonishingly, I discovered that he incurred no charges for this. Aside from this, it has been general weirdness. Running down the street yelling, wearing winter clothing in the summer, sometimes boxers in the winter, collecting shopping carts, breaking windows, etc. Over the last 2 years, he has become focused more on me. I first noticed when he told me to stop contacting him, as in, I had become one of the voices. I had always been neighborly to him and helped how I could, but it is becoming clear that he is directing his paranoia at me, 40-ish dude. He is becoming more aggressive. Slashed tires, trampled plants, things missing. I call the police, they take a record, and say there is nothing they can do. I call his father, and he tells me he is an adult and can't make him check into a facility. He won't sell the house or move him. For reference, They are from somewhere in the world that attempting an exorcism is a reasonable course of action. Last week, he began banging on my door at 3 a.m. nightly. He thinks I am stealing his rap lyrics, like I am going to publish an album about killing and raping white people. My family is terrified, and he runs by the time I make it outside. I report it every time, but he doesn't answer the door, and the cops' chart crisis team just leave. I really feel like the system is dropping the ball here, and it is going to take an incident for something to be done. Maybe not the scariest thing in the world to you, dear reader, but it is in mine. Edit. Thanks for all of the thoughtful replies. Thought I would answer some. I'm pretty broke, so moving or lawyering is not really an option. We are in the process of a protection order, but that requires several trips to the downtown courthouse. I am saving for a few cameras. I'm a bit ashamed, but I did purchase a handgun a few years ago because of him. I wouldn't use it unless he forced his way into my house. I have done everything I can think of to get the system to work. We have gone to the police station multiple times. We have the mobile health crisis unit's number and call them when it seems like he needs an evaluation. We have asked his parents to intervene. We have asked him personally to contact his caseworker to get help. We really want him to be able to live a good life, but I can't personally do it for him, and the system seems to be reactionary. The Spider-Man of Denver, Mrs. Peters, was an elderly woman who broke her hip in a fall, leaving her husband alone in their house while she stayed in the hospital. He was found bludgeoned to death in their home, which was obviously a shock to poor Mrs. Peters, especially as there wasn't a sign of forced entry. But a few weeks later, she moved back into the home with a housekeeper. Not for long, though, since both women heard noises, saw Mr. Peters' ghost walking the halls, and found objects and food moved or missing. They left the house in terror. The neighborhood rumor of the haunted house spread. People saw movement in the now empty house, and police were put on patrol. Then one night, they chased the suspected intruder in the house right into one of the house's closets and up through the entrance to the coffin-sized attic, an entrance that the officers saw and didn't enter in investigating Mr. Peters' death, as they believed it was only large enough to allow spiders inside. He had been living in the attic before Mrs. Peters' accident and assumed the house was empty when he came down to surprise Mr. Peters, and in the ensuing confrontation, beat him to death, just to return to his attic hideaway and live there while his widow lived downstairs. Not me, but my mother. This was years back before I was born, and it was just my bro and sis with my mom. Anyways, we attended a local church in our area, and my parents and a few others were building a playground for the kids, as my dad was an architect and a few other dads were contractors. Both my parsons were up there helping build, with both my siblings there as well. But it was getting late, so my mom decided to head home with my siblings and get ready for bed. She gets home and parks the car in front of the house. By now it's about 11:40 p.m., she said. And before she goes to open her driver door to get out, she notices a car pulled up next to her. The car was so close, she wouldn't have been able to open her door all the way. She tries to look at the guy and maybe ask what's going on, but all the windows are completely tinted and pitch black, but she did see his silhouette, and he was staring right at her. As she's sitting there thinking to herself what's going on and what she should do, she realizes that he's out of the car, making his way to my mom's passenger side door. Thankfully, to quick thinking, my mom locks the doors and peels out Barley, missing the car parked in front of her as she's driving away. He tried to box her in on the street. She makes it to the main road, but soon realizes that he is too, not far behind her with his headlights blaring in her rearview mirror. So she starts going pedal to the metal, trying to shake this guy, like being in the left turn lane but turning right at the last second, making U-turns on a dime, etc., all at 50 to 60 miles per hour too, but he's staying on her tail. So by this point, she obviously knows this guy is after her, so she starts trying to do everything illegal that she possibly can to get as much attention drawn to her, hopefully catching a cop's eye as the streets are empty at this time of night in our small town. She said after about 10 minutes of him chasing her, the headlights all but turn off and she can't see anything. Few seconds later, red and blue lights flood the car and sirens fill the air. So she pulls over, cracks her window just enough to whisper through, and has her 2 feet on both the brake and gas ready to go if she needs. Because at this point, she didn't know if this guy was going to use a fake cop rouse for anything. The cop walks up, asks why she was going so fast, to which my mom didn't answer, and immediately asks him to call into dispatch. Tell them he's pulling her over and to show her his gun and badge to know he was a real cop, or she was driving off. This cop was undercover too, might I add, so he just looks like an average guy. She's panicking and has fear in her voice, and I think the cop realized that at this point, so he calls dispatch to tell them he's pulled someone over, to which they reply, shows her his gun, vest, badge, and anything else he can do to calm her down at this point. She believes him and finally tells him why she was speeding, to which he says, "Was the car all black with very tinted windows?" She says yes, and he replies, "That's the exact car that I'm looking for out here tonight. There's been multiple reports of a car to that description stalking or kidnapping young children and women in the nearby areas." After that, they finish talking, he sends her home with an escort and a police unit orked outside all night. After that, my mom never heard or saw anything of the guy ever again. This was before I was born, so I have no clue if there was any official article or anything about this guy, unfortunately. But fortunately, my mom and siblings got away that night, and nothing bad ever came off it. However, it's scary to think what would have happened if that cop didn't show up, or my mom didn't lock the car door in time. TLDR. My mother was chased down late at night in a high-speed chase by a man who had reportedly stalked, kidnapped women and children in the surrounding area, but managed to escape. Some years ago, I worked as a general manager at a Hungry Howie's Pizza in North Canton, Ohio. Basically, the whole time I was there, I closed the store with a child murderer. You can look him up. His name is James Mamone, and he is currently on death row. The night he did it, he was closing with me. He was a driver. It was odd, because he was in all black and acting kinda strange, but I just blew it off. Look at the guy's pic and you'll see why. He was always off. Anyway, he leaves and I go home. Later on that night, I get a call from him and he's saying he wanted to come hang out and he needed to talk about his divorce and some other things. I declined because it's about 4 a.m. and I worked at 7. Fast forward to that morning, and it turns out the cops caught him in his driveway with his 2 young children stabbed to death in their car seats. He also killed his ex-mother-in-law that night. He called 4 of my co-workers trying to get into their houses. He was going to kill whoever was inside and hide out. Fucking bastard. I fed those kids the night before.